Before the sound came, there was only the clink of ice in a glass and the ordinary murmur of a coffee shop at 7 in the evening. Then the hand came down. The whole room went silent, as if someone had hit mute. Not one slap. Two. The man standing there was in his early 30s, tailored black suit, hair combed back in the way of someone who had never once had to pay for his own haircut. The woman sitting across from him didn't sway. She only tilted her head slightly, as if the pain that had just landed were a question she was deciding whether to answer. By the espresso counter, an employee froze. A dish towel still hung over her shoulder, neither falling nor being lifted. Near the entrance, an older woman pressed her hand to her mouth. Not one of the 24 people in the room dared to breathe hard. Tanner Ashford, the mayor of Atlanta's only son, didn't know he had just made the worst mistake of his life. He also didn't know that the woman named Jasmine Carter was quietly sliding her phone from her jacket pocket. In the next 30 seconds, she would dial a number she knew by heart. A number that, once called, could not be taken back. 4 weeks earlier, no one in this coffee shop had ever heard the name Jasmine Carter. 6 weeks later, no one in Atlanta would be able to forget it. 3 weeks before that hand landed on her cheek, Jasmine Carter had told an old friend, "I'm about to go back to the one place I swore I'd never return to." Jasmine landed at Hartsfield-Jackson on a Tuesday morning, the hour before Atlanta's sun had fully sharpened, when the humidity still lay over the pavement like a thin cloth no one had shaken out yet. She didn't hire a car service. She drove a gray rental sedan herself, windows down halfway, radio off. Nothing but the wind moving through and the tires humming against the still damp asphalt. She always thought best in motion. It was something she'd learned about herself and somewhere between law school and the 4 cities she'd worked in since. Atlanta was different. Atlanta was the place she had left. She'd grown up in Vine City, in a low-roofed house on a street lined with old oaks that had stood there longer than anyone still living on the block. The house had a porch too small for furniture, and a kitchen light that stayed on late into the night, because her mother, Marva Carter, would still be sitting there grading papers for her evening class. Marva Carter had run an adult literacy program at the Vine City Community Center for 11 years. She taught men in their 50s reading a full newspaper page for the first time, women learning to sign their own names on a form instead of leaving a mark. She never told anyone the exact numbers, but according to the most recent adult skills survey from the U.S. National Center for Education Statistics, published at the end of 2024, the share of American adults falling into the lowest literacy skill bracket rose from 19% in 2017 to 28% in 2023, an increase the agency itself called substantial, larger than the swings normally seen in international assessments. To Jasmine, that wasn't a distant statistic. It was her mother's lit kitchen, 11 years running, every weeknight, trying to pull one more person out on the right side of that growing number. Jasmine left Atlanta at 18 with a full scholarship and a clarity of purpose she'd never fully been able to explain to anyone who asked, because the explanations required a story she wasn't ready to tell. The decade that followed carried her through rooms that mattered: law school in Boston, a fellowship in Chicago, 2 years with a federal oversight nonprofit in Washington, before she moved into independent investigative consulting, the kind of work that didn't fit neatly on a business card, but that the people who needed it understood right away. She was 27. She looked younger than that, and she'd long since stopped finding it inconvenient, because it was useful in the way any wrong assumption from the other side of a table was useful. Her skin was dark, catching light without releasing it. Her hair was natural, cropped close. Her clothes were always clean and simple, the kind of wardrobe that said nothing about the person wearing it, except that she'd decided there were better things to spend her attention on. She drove slowly through the city, noting what had changed and what hadn't. The old Fourth Ward waterfront now had glass-fronted buildings, restaurants with outdoor terraces, a shopping complex that hadn't existed when she was a child. Vine City had a new greenway, young oaks planted along it, brightly painted bike lanes, community garden plots behind low fences. Along the main boulevard, Banners hung from the lampposts in the city's official colors, Atlanta. Building tomorrow, together. And beneath each banner, in smaller but still legible type, the name of the man who wanted credit for all of it, Mayor Preston Ashford. She had read everything published about him over the past 20 months. She had also read what hadn't been published. That was considerably more interesting. Preston Ashford was 57, 6 years into holding the mayor's office. Tall, silver-haired, carrying the easy confidence of a lifetime spent being told he belonged wherever he stood, rather than confidence built from competence. He gave clean sound bites to the press, rolled up his sleeves at neighborhood events, and had perfected over the years the particular art of saying very little while giving the impression of having said everything. His only son, Tanner, 28, had lived his whole life in the long, comfortable shadow of his father, never once required to build a version of himself. Over the years, he'd left behind a trail of small cruelties quietly managed by people whose job it was to manage such things. A nightclub altercation scrubbed from a police report. A business dispute settled in a particular direction by a call from City Hall. These things had happened. They had been handled. That was the nature of being Preston Ashford's son in Atlanta. Jasmine hadn't come back for Tanner. She'd come back for a woman named Loretta Vance. Loretta had been the senior budget analyst in the city's infrastructure procurement office for 13 years, before being reassigned 3 years earlier to a position with a desk, a computer, no staff, no authority, and a title created specifically to avoid the word demotion. The reassignment had come 6 weeks after she raised a formal objection to a contract authorization she'd identified as procedurally irregular. Loretta had reached Jasmine through a careful chain of 4 contacts 7 weeks earlier. She had documents. She had emails. She had the kind of institutional knowledge that couldn't be deleted or shredded because it lived inside a person who had been present at every meeting for every decision made in rooms where the official minutes were written to reflect as little as possible. Tonight, Jasmine would meet Loretta at a small coffee shop on Auburn Avenue. Loretta's suggestion, since no one from City Hall ever ate there, and it was always busy on Tuesday evenings, meaning their presence wouldn't be remarkable. She parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest, low heels tapping quietly on the sidewalk. She pushed through the door at 7:44, was shown to the corner table by the window she'd specifically requested when booking, giving her a clear line of sight to both entrances. She sat down, ordered water, folded her hands, and waited. She didn't hear Tanner Ashford come in so much as feel him first. A shift in the quality of the noise, the way certain voices fill a room differently than others, the way a particular kind of attention enters a room and rearranges it. Tanner came through the door at 7:51 with 4 friends and his girlfriend, Chloe. They entered the way people enter when they've always been the most important people in whatever room they walk into. Not looking at anyone, not needing to. A lifetime of being used to a room turning to face them first. They hadn't been inside 30 seconds before. Tanner's mood shifted. He glanced out the window, saw the car parked along the curb out front, the spot his friend Julian always used. Not a reserved space, not a private lot. Simply the spot a group of people with enough social confidence had decided was theirs through habit and repetition, and through the fact that no one had ever challenged it. "Whose car is that?" His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The room went a little quieter. People at nearby tables found something else to look at. Somebody parked in our spot. He looked around the room, slow, face by face. Not a question. An announcement. Who had the nerve? Silence spread like a held breath. No one answered. A woman near the door shifted in her chair. Julian, standing just behind Tanner, tugged lightly at his friend's sleeve. "Let it go, man. Let's just sit." Tanner didn't turn to look at him. "You just let people walk over you like that?" A waiter carrying a dessert tray passed by, and Tanner grabbed his arm. Not violently, but with the certainty of someone who'd never been told a man carrying a tray had a right not to be grabbed. The tray wobbled. The woman sitting alone by the window. "Who is she?" The waiter glanced toward where Tanner was looking, then back at him. He pointed because in that moment, not pointing seemed more dangerous than pointing. Jasmine didn't look up. She'd already clagged the entrance, weighed the energy in the room, and decided to stay still until engagement became unavoidable. It became unavoidable when footsteps crossed the room and stopped at her table. His 4 friends fanned out behind him, close enough to serve as an audience. Chloe hung back a step, arms wrapped around her own elbows. "That your car out there?" "Yes," Jasmine said, not looking up right away. "You parked in our spot." "There's no sign saying it's reserved," she said, meeting his eyes now. "It's a public curb." The shift in Tanner's expression was immediate and total. He'd crossed the room expecting an apology, or at least some deference, and had received neither. And the absence of both produced in him a specific outrage, born of a specific surprise. He said a great deal after that, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, that she had no idea whose spot that was, that she had no idea whose city this was, that people like her didn't get to park wherever they pleased, that there were ways things worked in Atlanta she clearly didn't understand, that I looked like someone who took up space that wasn't hers, that she looked like nobody, that she looked like someone who'd wandered into a place she had no business being. He said all of it with the fluent, practiced ease of someone for whom contempt had never once had a cost attached to it. Jasmine said nothing. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, steadily, without hurry, without the performance of a reaction he was trying to provoke. That made him angrier. Her silence to him read as a kind of defiance worse than talking back. "When I walk into a room and ask a question," he said, his voice now carrying an ugliness that had been waiting behind the volume, "people answer." He raised his hand. The first slap landed, flat and final, reaching every corner of the cafe before anyone understood what they'd just heard. Jasmine's head tilted slightly with the force of it. A red mark rose fast on her cheek. No one moved. Jasmine didn't step back. She didn't cry either. "When I walk into a room and ask a question," Tanner repeated, his voice now carrying a note of triumph, "people answer." He raised his hand a second time. The second slap was harder. The water glass on the table trembled. At the table near the door, the older woman burst into tears. She couldn't hold back. A man half rose from his chair, then sat back down, as if even he wasn't sure what he'd meant to do. Chloe stepped back further, hand over her mouth, and there was no trace left on her face of the glass havoc she'd walked in with. Only an expression Jasmine recognized instantly, the look of someone who had seen this kind of behavior before, and still hadn't decided what to do about having seen it. "That's enough." The voice came from the bar. The bartender, a man in his 50s, had stepped out from behind the counter, both hands raised but not moving closer. "You need to leave now." Tanner spun around, sneering. "Who are you talking to?" "You." The bartender didn't lower his voice, didn't step back, though his hand trembled slightly as he pointed toward the door. "This whole cafe just watched you hit a woman sitting quietly at her own table. I don't care whose son you are." A few people in the room clapped softly, hesitantly, then pulled back the moment they registered the sound of their own hands. Tanner stood there, hand still raised, and for the first time that evening something in his eyes wavered. Not remorse. The bewilderment of someone discovering for the first time that a room wasn't automatically going to side with him. Jasmine raised one hand and touched the corner of her mouth with 2 fingers. She examined them, saw a faint trace of blood. She lowered her hand, reached into her jacket's inner pocket, and pulled out her phone. Over the 43 seconds that followed, while Tanner turned back to his friends and said something meant to land as a joke that no one in the group laughed at, Jasmine dialed a number she knew by heart. "Renata," she said when the line picked up. "It's time. Yes, we're ready. The cafe on Auburn." A pause. "Thank you." She set the phone face down on the table. Tanner was watching her from across the room with an expression that had begun as triumph and at its edges was beginning to become something, without a name yet, but that in the weeks to come would become recognizable as the first cold touch of consequence. The next 9 minutes were the longest of Tanner Ashford's life. He stood near the entrance with his friends. Conversation restarted, though it was different now, slightly effortful. The way conversation becomes when the person at center is also, beneath everything else, listening for something he can't identify. Chloe wasn't standing close to him anymore. She'd stepped apart entirely, eyes on the door. Then 3 black SUVs pulled up along the curb outside, engines off. The people inside stepped out and moved into the cafe with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who'd been briefed in advance and were simply waiting for a signal. The host stepped forward, then stepped back. 2 of them showed credentials without slowing their pace. Behind the dark suits was a woman in her 50s. Silver-streaked hair cut short and practical, dark blazer, low heels. Waltzing of someone who had spent 30 years making consequential decisions in difficult rooms, and through the accumulation of that experience had become very calm about all of it. Jasmine, she said, and there was warmth in it. Beneath the warmth, the particular quality of professional respect, the kind that cannot be performed, only earned and then genuinely extended. Renata, Jasmine answered, rising briefly. Thank you for coming. Renata Cole, Special Federal Investigator, a position created specifically for a broad-scope inquiry into procurement irregularities across a set of identified municipalities. Tanner knew that face. He'd seen it on the kind of news coverage that appeared when something was announced at the federal level. His father had referred to it 18 months earlier with the studied neutrality of a man who didn't want to appear concerned. He hadn't thought further about it at the time. He thought about it now. Renata sat down, opened a folder, spoke in a voice low enough to be private and clear enough to carry to the nearest 3 tables. The authorizations confirmed. The team is staged. We can move tonight. 19 minutes later, Loretta Vance came in through the side entrance, moving to Jasmine's table with the contained stillness of a woman who had made a costly decision and resolved, having made it, not to look back. She set a small protective case on the table, opened it, and produced an encrypted drive and a sealed white envelope, her name written across it in her own hand. The drive has everything I was able to preserve, she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her effort to hold it steady. Contract records, emails, payment routing summaries. I built myself before the reassignment. The envelope is my formal statement, handwritten, signed. I wanted it clear it came directly from me. She had worked in the city's budget office for 13 years. She had watched contracts move through the procurement cycle, watched the names attached to them cycle through a rotation that wasn't obviously irregular at first, until she laid them side by side and the pattern emerged. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, 2024 report to the nations, 43% of fraud cases inside organizations, private and public alike, are first uncovered because of an insider tip, more than 3 times any other detection method, including audits or routine financial review. Loretta didn't know that number. She only knew she'd sat at a desk no one looked at for 3 years, watching the clock move day after day, and had decided that couldn't continue. The first signal she'd ever found was an infrastructure contract for repairs to Atlanta's Western Water Treatment System, awarded to a company she couldn't locate in any state business registry until 3 days after the contract was signed, at which point a new registration appeared, backdated 6 weeks. The contract was worth $19 million. An independent assessment later found should have cost about $11 million. The $8 million difference had not been absorbed into legitimate cost overruns. It had flowed through a chain of consulting arrangements and subcontracts into the hands of individuals with documented connections to Mayor Ashford's campaign apparatus and to his own family. That was the first contract. There were 3 others. Each followed the same structure. Companies that barely existed at the time of award. Costs well above internal estimates. Payment chains moving through intermediary entities in amounts carefully sized to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. The total discrepancy across all 4 contracts was $37 million. Outside the glass front, the 3 SUVs sat parked and still. Inside, Tanner stood near the entrance, eyes fixed on the corner table, where 3 women were bent over documents he couldn't read from that distance. Batassan, sis? Last. But somehow with a cold certainty spreading through his chest that whatever was sitting on that table was going to determine the rest of his father's life. And maybe the rest of his own. Preston Ashford took the call at 11. 41 that night, in his home study, still in his dinner clothes, reviewing internal polling numbers with his chief of staff. The number on the screen was one he recognized and didn't want to see calling at this hour, at any hour. A contact saved in his phone only as a set of initials. He excused himself with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to performing composure in front of subordinates, took the call by the window, looked out at the Atlanta skyline, the waterfront he'd helped rebuild. He listened with the expression of a man who had spent considerable effort building something he believed was sturdier than it was. He said very little. He asked 3 questions. He ended the call and stood at the window a long time, unmoving. In the room behind him, his chief of staff waited with the polling numbers still on the table. The number said 75%. They would never again mean what they had meant an hour before. His response in the days that followed was the response of a man who had always been able to make problems disappear. He called 3 lawyers. He called in favors from people who owed him, city council members, a state official, a federal liaison whose loyalty he'd long assumed was purchased and permanent. His communications director began drafting statements. The strategy was consistent throughout. The investigation was politically motivated, a coordinated effort by interests threatened by a reformist administration, an attempt to use federal process as a weapon against a mayor whose only offense was effectiveness. He also made other calls. 2 of Loretta's former colleagues, people whose cooperation with any outside investigation would matter, received visits from strangers, words chosen carefully, stopping just short of an explicit threat, but communicating unmistakably what kind of pressure could be applied if cooperation continued. One of them called Jasmine's team the very next morning and reported the full contact. The report was added to the file under a heading that hadn't existed the week before: witness intimidation. Another Sandra Obi, a 17-year procurement veteran not easily frightened, received 3 anonymous texts over 2 days and a voicemail from a number traced to a prepaid phone bought with cash at a convenience store on the city's west side. She kept the voicemail and turned it over to Renata's office that same afternoon. Jasmine received a different kind of pressure. A call from a man named David Okafor, introducing himself as an independent representative for parties interested in a quiet resolution. He didn't say Ashford's name outright. He didn't need to. "We understand you've put in a lot of work," he said. "We also understand that work deserves to be compensated in a legitimate, proper way." He offered a consulting payment of $250,000 in exchange for her holding off filing for 6 months. Enough time, he said, for the relevant parties to sort things out internally, appropriately. Jasmine listened to the whole offer without interrupting. Then she asked him one question. Under what name would that payment be recorded? He hesitated, said it would be structured as a legitimate consulting contract, with invoices, with a documented scope of work. So you're asking me to help you create exactly the kind of falsified record I'm investigating, she said. Not angry, just clear. He hung up without another word. Jasmine sat with the phone in her hand a long while afterward, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the weight of the moment. Not because, though because of the money, the $250,000, wasn't nothing to an independent consultant still paying off 10-year-old law school loans, but because for the first time in 7 weeks, the system she was tracing had stopped trying to square her and started trying to make her part of it. She called and reported it to Renata that same night. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she sat down with a cold cup of coffee and reopened the list of intermediary transfers. Loretta had traced from the Community Development Fund, cross-referencing each line against the timeline of community program cuts over the past 3 years. She found it on the 11th line, Atlanta Community Development Fund, Infrastructure Priority Reallocation. The same fiscal year her mother's literacy program lost its funding. The same year the $8 million discrepancy from the first water contract began moving through the intermediary company chain. Her hand, always steady, trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. She didn't add it to the official file, not yet. It was still only a timing coincidence, not a verified financial trail. But She knew, sitting there in the gray light of an Atlanta morning, that she would never look at those 4 contracts the same way again, and that perhaps the money that had swallowed her mother's evening class wasn't just an incidental budget decision. Perhaps it was one more link in the very chain she'd spent 7 weeks tracing. She didn't rush to conclude anything. That wasn't how she worked. But for the rest of that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that the line between her job and something much more personal was blurring, 1 degree at a time, in a way that didn't sit entirely comfortably. That afternoon, Preston Ashford's personal legal team sent a formal letter to Jasmine's firm, alleging her evidence-gathering methods had violated city data privacy regulations, threatening a civil suit if any documents were released before a ruling on the legality of their sourcing. A stalling tactic, but it still cost Renata's legal team 3 days preparing a response. During those 3 days, something else happened. A group of parents whose children had once attended the Vine City Literacy Program, dissolved 3 years now, happened to gather for a small fundraiser for a similar program that had recently reopened in part. Thanks to private donations, Loretta, whose nephew had once studied there, invited Jasmine, not for the case, but so you can breathe a little before the hearing. Jasmine arrived late, stood at the back, watched older women take the microphone, and described learning to read for the first time at 53, 58, 61. A woman named Delia said that for 40 years she'd pretended to forget her reading glasses whenever someone handed her a form to fill out, just so no one would know she couldn't read it. Her voice shook as she said it. Then she laughed, a laugh more relieved than joyful, and the room applauded. A man named Otis read aloud, slow but steady, from the first book he'd ever read cover to cover. His mother's Bible, left to him when she died, before he'd ever been able to read a single line of it himself. His voice caught partway through a sentence. He stopped, took a breath, kept going. The room went completely silent until he finished, then erupted in applause. Someone cried openly. Jasmine stood at the back, and for that moment she wasn't an investigator, wasn't someone about to go to war with a sitting mayor. She was only Marva Carter's daughter, watching a small room try to rebuild what her mother had once, with far fewer resources than before it was cut. She left before anyone recognized her, stood outside in the parking lot for a while, let the wind hit her face until she was sure her eyes were dry again. That evening, David Okafor called a second time, his tone no longer polite. He said there were ways to make things difficult for an independent consultancy in this city, that her license was under review by 2 different boards, that she should think carefully about what actually mattered to her career. She recorded the call, sent it to Renata, sat alone afterward in her hotel room. A colleague she respected, someone she'd once worked a case with in Chicago, called with a careful suggestion that the Ashford matter was becoming complicated enough to affect her future work in the region, that there were ways to structure an exit that preserved her professional standing. That, sometimes the strategic choice, was the one that kept you available for the next fight. She listened to all of it, thanked him for the call, then sat in the quiet of her hotel room afterward, wondering whether she herself was being tempted too, not by money, but by exhaustion. The next day, something unexpected happened. Julian, Tanner's friend, the very person whose parking spot had set the whole evening in motion, called Renata's office and asked to give a voluntary statement. He recounted exactly what had happened that night, leaving out no detail, including the line he'd said to Tanner right before the first slap. "Let it go, man," and his regret at not saying it louder, at not doing more to stop his friend. "I couldn't stop it," he told Renata's attorney, his voice breaking. "But at least I can tell the truth about what happened. It wasn't a heroic act, but it was something, and in a file otherwise full of names that had chosen silence, it stood out." Jasmine pulled out the photograph Loretta had given her the week before. Loretta standing with a group of young women at a vocational training graduation, 15 years earlier, a program that had also once drawn funding from the very community development fund that had later been reallocated. She didn't recognize any of the young faces, but she recognized the pattern repeating itself. Small, quiet programs service communities without a loud enough voice at City Hall, quietly strangled to make room for larger, quieter flows of money into pockets that needed it far less. She tucked the photo into her wallet, not as evidence, but as a reminder of why this work mattered. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting her final presentation for the hearing 3 days out, writing until the sky outside turned from black to gray, her fingers still moving across the keyboard when her phone lit up with a new message from Renata. The message was one line. New witness. Call me the moment you're up. Jasmine didn't wait to be up because she'd never gone to sleep. She called immediately. Renata explained that a former senior executive staffer from the mayor's office, someone who had once taken minutes for private meetings among the mayor's top advisors, had reached out through his own attorney the night before. His name was Marcus Whitfield, 31, who had worked 2 years in the mayor's office before resigning without public explanation 14 months earlier. He wanted to testify, but only in person, at the public hearing, so the whole city hears it at once. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning at the Atlanta Civic Center, seating 300, full, by 8:45 in the morning. Preston Ashford arrived with his legal team and communications director, carrying the bearing of a man who had decided the only viable posture, given everything printed in the past 2 weeks, was full, unqualified confidence. He wore charcoal gray, his campaign color. Near the entrance, a cluster of supporters held signs reading "Stand with Mayor Ashford," and he stopped to greet them, shaking hands, holding eye contact the way he always did, because this too was a kind of performance, and performance was something he knew how to do. He was given 14 minutes to speak. He described the investigation as politically motivated, a coordinated effort by interests threatened by his administration's reform agenda. His voice was even, his pauses precisely placed. He made eye contact with committee members in the front row and with the cameras at the back of the room, giving a convincing impression of a man who was indignant rather than afraid. In the gallery, his supporters nodded. The room held its breath. Then Jasmine Carter stood up. She presented for 47 minutes. No theatrics, no rhetorical architecture, no attempt to perform the gravity of what she was presenting, because the documents, laid out in sequence, did that themselves. She went through each contract. She identified each company. She traced each pastry chain through its registration, its shell structure, its routing, and its destination. She displayed procurement emails on the screens above the committee table, specific, dated, written in the ordinary, unguarded language of people who had believed at the time that their communications were private. She named the individuals. She identified their relationships to the mayor's office. How many people in that room, I find myself wondering, had once sat at a desk very much like Loretta's, waiting long enough for someone to believe them, long enough for someone to finally do something about it. She presented Loretta Vance's formal testimony, and Loretta, seated 3 rows back, hands folded in her lap, nodded once, when her name was read into the record. A few minutes later, Jasmine read an excerpt from Julian's statement too, the young man who had voluntarily confirmed every detail of that night. Not enough to redeem himself entirely, but enough to show that even someone who had once stood on Tanner's side could no longer deny what had happened. Several committee members who had arrived that morning with their arms folded, in the posture of people who had already decided what they were watching, had by the 20-minute mark begun to lean forward. By the 35th minute, 2 of them were taking notes. By the 40th, the room had undergone a shift that was not dramatic and not announced, but that everyone present could feel. In the gallery, Tanner sat very still. He had come out of a loyalty he didn't yet know how to separate from assumption, feeling his presence was owed to his father. Then, somewhere in the second half of the presentation, he stopped watching his father and started watching the screens. He recognized a company name he'd heard once before, mentioned in passing at dinner, framed as an example of local business contributing to the city's growth. He recognized dates that lined up with periods he remembered for other reasons. A name he'd once seen in his father's phone. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat there and watched the documented specific truth of something he had never wanted to know. At the 30-minute mark, Tanner noticed his father had stopped looking at the committee members and had begun looking down at the table. He had never once seen his father look down at a table before. It was the smallest thing. It was not a small thing at all. The final witness wasn't on the morning's agenda. Marcus Whitfield was introduced during the afternoon session, following a brief closed consultation between Renata and the panel chair. He carried a tablet in a protective case. When the chair asked him to present his evidence, he set the tablet on the witness table, connected it to the room's audio system with a cable he pulled from his jacket pocket, and pressed a single button. What followed was 42 seconds of audio. The recording opened with the ambient sound of an interior room, chairs, a ventilation system, the particular acoustic quality of a space with high ceilings and closed doors. Then voices. One of them everyone recognized instantly. Warren Ashford's voice in the recording did not sound indignant. It sounded precise. It directed, in clear and unhurried language, the mechanism by which a specific contract would be awarded to a specific company, which would then route a specified amount through prearranged intermediary accounts to named recipients. A dollar figure, a timeline, a reference spoken in the easy shorthand of someone who assumed he was among people who shared his context to how an earlier transaction had been handled. A reference that matched directly to the first contract Jasmine had presented that morning. The room stayed very quiet for a long time after the recording ended. Preston Ashford sat at the wristband's table, unmoving. Then he leaned toward his attorney. His attorney rose and requested a recess. It was granted. Preston Ashford rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and began walking toward the door with his legal team arranged around him. The hearing room's lights catching on the face of his watch, the heavy wooden door ahead of him, slowly swinging open under a security officer's hand. And by the time the door closed behind him, 3 local news cameras had caught the full moment he walked past the gallery without once turning his head toward his son. By 6 that evening, Ashford's communications director issued a statement calling the recording potentially manipulated, promising a full legal response. That response never came. Within 24 hours, his 2 largest campaign donors announced they were suspending financial support until the investigation's outcome was known. By the next afternoon, the state party chair issued a careful institutional statement calling for full cooperation with federal oversight. By the end of the week, 5 city council members who had long been consistent allies had established what their own communications teams called appropriate professional distance. His approval rating, 75% before the hearing, was measured by internal pollsters at 19% within a single week. The following Thursday morning, as word of a resignation spread through local newsrooms, a small group of Vine City residents, including a few former literacy program students, among them Delia and Otis, who had once stood up and spoken at that small fundraiser, gathered spontaneously on the steps of City Hall. No signs, no chants, just standing there quietly, a reminder that those stolen millions had once had a concrete shape. A classroom with its lights off, a program strangled into silence, a Bible one man couldn't read for himself until he was 61. Preston Ashford filed his resignation in writing the following Tuesday, 6 days after the hearing concluded. His communications director read the statement in the City Hall lobby. He wasn't present. Reporters who had covered his administration for years sat with their recorders running, notebooks open, listening to the formal language of a carefully managed retreat. Phrases about prioritizing family, about confidence in the city's institutions. Many of them wrote down not what was said, but what wasn't. No apology, no specific admission, not once the word sorry. Preston Ashford was formally indicted on 6 counts of procurement fraud, contract manipulation, and obstruction of justice that winter, along with 3 other city officials. The trial was set for the following year. Lorette Vance received an official commendation from Renata Cole's office, explicitly acknowledging that she had correctly identified the wrongdoing, had reported it through the proper channel, and had been wrongfully reassigned in retaliation. Nothing could truly compensate for 3 years at a desk with no staff, no authority, but at least her record was restored, existing now in a form no one could manage or restructure away. The city appointed an interim mayor and announced a comprehensive audit of every contract awarded over the past 6 years. The city's ethics commission, largely dormant through most of Ashford's tenure, was reconstituted with new members and expanded authority. The first water treatment contract, the one Loretta had flagged from the desk she should never have been assigned to, was reopened and rebid through a transparent public process with independent verification at every stage, going to a regional contractor at a cost 31% lower than what the original contractor had charged for the unfinished work. And at a city council meeting, 2 months later, buried among dry line items about budgets and allocations, a new funding measure passed almost unnoticed, partially restoring funding for grassroots community programs that had been cut under the banner of infrastructure priority reallocation. Jasmine read the news on the city's public bulletin while sitting in a different cafe, in a different city, preparing to open a new file. Her finger paused on the screen for a beat, and she felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks, before she quietly closed her laptop, stood, and walked out into the evening, settling beyond the window glass. 6 months later, Jasmine drove back to Vine City one last time before moving on to the next file. Tanner lost everything the way most people lose things they never really owned. Slowly at first, then all at once. The friends from those cafe nights drifted apart over the following weeks with the cold practicality of people who had always been calculating and had simply updated their arithmetic. The messages that once came constantly slowed, then stopped. The video of the two slaps, filmed from 4 different phones and circulated within an hour of the event, became the image permanently attached to his name in Atlanta. Permanently, and in direct proportion to how prominent he had once been. He tried twice, through intermediaries, to reach Jasmine. She declined both times. Not angrily, without explanation, simply declined. Whatever changed in Tanner, if anything did, changed without an audience. Slowly, in the ordinary, unglamorous way most real changes happen, through the accumulation of small discomforts and the reluctant, gradual revision of assumptions he had held so long, he no longer recognized them as assumptions. But this story doesn't owe him the telling of that. He hadn't earned the telling of that. Jasmine parked in front of the old house on the street lined with old oaks. A different family lived there now. Toys in the narrow front yard. A wind chime on the porch her family had never had. She sat in the car looking at it a while, then got out and walked 3 blocks to the community center where her mother had taught for 11 years. The wooden door still creaked the way she remembered. Inside, fluorescent light fell across a row of folding tables, and at the last one, a woman in her 60s was carefully sounding out words on a job application, a young volunteer beside her, patiently pointing at each line. Marva Carter no longer taught. She'd retired 3 years earlier, right when the program closed, but she still stopped by now and then, like a regular visitor to the room she'd once built. The class had reopened, smaller than before, with about a third of its old students, thanks to the restored funding from 2 months earlier and a bit of private donation after the Ashford case made local news. Jasmine stood in the doorway, not going in yet. She watched the woman at the last table read aloud, haltingly, "I have 5 years of experience managing warehouse inventory." Slow, but correct, word by word. And when she finished the sentence, she looked up and smiled. A smile that needed no explanation. Something in Jasmine's chest tightened. Not with pain, with warmth. She stood there a moment longer before stepping fully inside. Long enough that no one would notice her eyes were a little red. She never told anyone the real reason she had said yes, the moment Loretta Vance's name reached her, 7 weeks before the hearing. She didn't use it as a credential. She wasn't the kind of person who used personal pain as a credential, but she carried it the way people carry anything that has become load-bearing in their own architecture. Not in her hands, not on display, but present in everything she built. According to the Federal Reserve's 2024 Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth of a white family in the United States now stands at roughly $285,000, compared to about $45,000 for a black family. And according to the National Association of Realtors' 2025 report, The homeownership gap between the two groups has widened to 28 percentage points over the past decade. Those weren't numbers Jasmine needed to look up to understand. They were the low-roofed house she grew up in, sold 3 times over since her mother left it. They were 11 years of an evening class, quietly defunded so the money could flow somewhere else, and the children who might have come through it in the years since. She stayed at the community center another hour, not saying who she was, just sitting in the back row, listening. Then she stood, went outside, and started the car. She drove out of Vine City the same way she'd driven in, past the low-roofed houses and the community gardens and the greenway with its young trees. She turned on the radio once she reached the highway, a habit she only allowed herself when leaving, never when arriving, because arriving required the particular quiet of attention, and leaving permitted the small, ordinary pleasure of sound. She drove with the windows cracked, heading toward another file. Another city, where maybe another woman was sitting at a desk, no one looked at, waiting for someone to believe her long enough to do something about it. There are nights, after I finish telling a story like this one, when I still find myself wondering what really changed in that room, in the moment that hand came down a second time, and that woman still didn't waver. I don't think it was strength the way we usually picture it. Not a scream, not loud resistance. It was a quieter kind of strength, belonging to someone who had decided long ago that her dignity didn't depend on whether anyone else recognized it. I think about people like Loretta in this story, sitting at a desk no one looked at for 3 years, simply because she dared to speak a truth no one wanted to hear. I think about how many of us right now are sitting at a desk like that, at work, in our families, in our own communities, waiting for someone to believe us, waiting for justice to arrive exactly when it's needed. And I think about mothers like Marva Carter, quietly keeping the light on in a small kitchen, teaching, giving without asking for credit, because that is the real foundation every later justice gets built on. I also think about people like Julian, who wasn't brave enough to stop his friend in the moment it mattered most, but who later found the courage to tell the truth when no one was forcing him to. We don't always manage to do the right thing at the exact moment it's needed most, but we always get a second chance to do the right thing, even late. To me, this story isn't really about the fall of a powerful man. It's about the way one woman chose to stand up straight while the whole room held its breath, waiting to see her break. It's about the way a quiet kindness, planted 11 years earlier in an evening classroom, eventually bloomed into justice for people who never even knew her. What about you? Has there ever been a moment in your life when you had to stand still and hold on to your dignity while the whole world seemed to be waiting for you to fall? Or has someone in your family, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, quietly sacrificed for something good that you only came to understand the value of much later? I'd love to hear your story down in the comments below. Sometimes those everyday stories, told and truly heard, are the ones that heal the most. Thank you for staying with me today, with Jasmine, with Loretta, with the whole city of Atlanta in this story. I'll see you in another one before too long.